Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries, where every case takes you deeper into suspense, secrets, and thrilling investigations inspired by the world of detectives. If you love solving puzzles and uncovering hidden truths, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's start the story. The estate stood like a sleeping beast on the shores of Lake Geneva. Half museum, part mausoleum, Maximilien de Vries' residence had long captivated collectors and connoisseurs, and with good reason. Few in Europe possessed the breadth and intensity of the man's antiquities collection, let alone the clandestine perfection with which he curated it. He rarely entertained. He never loaned. And to be welcome to his estate, the collector's shadow, as his most cynical rivals mocked it, was to gain access to a private sanctum. Inspector Gaston Leclerc of the Swiss police glanced gravely at the invitation. Folded nicely alongside the body, Maximilien de Vries had died. The library was pristine, despite the craziness of the situation. It had the chilly, unlived-in feel of a house preserved for worship rather than comfort. Mahogany shelves extended to the vaulted ceiling. Lights gleamed off the glass cases containing antique coins, Greek funerary masks, Roman scroll fragments, and a huge, unassuming wooden crate inscribed only in faded Sumerian glyphs. The collector himself, once magnificent but now crumpled, lay on the carpet, arm extended toward a toppled goblet of red wine. At first appearance, it could have been a fatal stroke. At second glance, it was not. The goblet's splintered stem was discovered by the fireplace rather than under the body. A physician had already hypothesized that the lethal contents were laced with strychnine, but there was no odor, stain, or other indications. There were only a few guests, yet they were all quite present enough to appear as stunned as they were wary. Gaston Leclerc was not an idiot. He'd dealt with difficult issues before, but the more he listened to the visitors' clumsy statements, so skillfully stated, so artfully timed, the more anxious he became. There were 5 of them. Everyone was now seated in the same room where their host had died the night before. Lady Helena Marsh of London society, elegant, domineering, and said to be de Vries' on-and-off confidant. Edward Langford is a solitary manuscript researcher who stammers and avoids eye contact. Solange Petit, de Vries' personal curator, is French-born and sharp-tongued, recognized for her impeccable recall and temperamental loyalty. Thomas Lucero, an Argentinian diamond appraiser and suspected smuggler, was shocked by his own invitation. Finally, Maximilien's estranged niece, Adriana de Vries, has arrived from America after nearly 2 decades of silence. Her wealth would be substantial, her alibi hazy. A poison-related death in a secured library, a room in which every item could be worth a fortune or a motive. But Leclerc understood his own limitations. He had called for rescue as soon as he saw the glass. That assistance had just arrived, disembarking from a hired motor launch on the villa's modest pier. A compact man in a pale grey suit, his patent leather shoes sparkling, his cap perched just right. His magnificently groomed moustache twitched as he inspected the house. Hercule Poirot, the world's most famous detective, climbed the steps with delicacy and theatrical flair. Leclerc greeted him at the threshold, visibly relieved. "Monsieur Poirot," he announced, "we have une situation rather delicate." Poirot took off his gloves, one finger at a time. "Mon ami," responded the gentleman, "if it were not delicate, you would not have called me." He took a single glimpse over the inspector's shoulder, taking in the solemn expressions, the velvet ropes around the cases, and the faint outline of the fallen body, which was already covered by a linen sheet. "Poison?" Poirot inquired softly. Leclerc nodded. "Yes, we believe in strychnine." Poirot lifted an eyebrow. A theatrical choice. He strolled cautiously into the room, his gaze moving from guest to guest, never pausing long, never lingering rudely, but always consuming. Lady Helena tossed her cigarette ash into a magnificent Grecian urn and offered him a smile that was too tight to be true. Edward Langford stood at the edge of the carpet looking at his shoes. Solange gripped a leather-bound inventory book, as if it were scripture. Lucero fixed his cufflinks with exaggerated calmness. Adriana, tall, poised, unreadable, sat motionless, hands folded in her lap, as if awaiting judgment. Poirot turned to Leclerc. "Mon ami," he replied quietly, "you are very correct. This is delicate. So let us not cause too much of a disturbance. The truth is like a vase. It must be lifted carefully." He paused. "Let's start with observation. And then there's interrogation." The visitors stared at each other. The air became tense. A collector had died. His riches remained. But one of them, a very human, very alive one, had stolen something far more valuable than any ancient treasure. Hercule. Poirot had only just begun to refine his little grey cells. Poirot stood just inside the Grand Library's threshold, his gaze shifting from one guest to the next with the deftness of a painter deciding which stroke would define a portrait. Each face provided its own calm, meticulous neutrality, but it was the kind of stillness that pricked rather than soothed. Even quiet, when examined carefully, has a posture, and to Hercule Poirot, the stance of stillness may convey volumes. Inspector. Leclerc attempted to open his notepad again, but Poirot raised a hand, gently, firmly. "No, my friend," he said, "let's not rush. The room, she still breathes with what happened last night. Allow me to listen." He strolled through the library with light, careful feet, pausing beside the velvet ropes that secured a Babylonian clay tablet and an open glass case housing a missing scroll, possibly removed for study or thievery. Poirot didn't touch anything. His gloved hands remained behind his back. But his eyes recorded everything. At last he turned to the assembled throng. "You will forgive me," he said with polite gravity, "but before I ask questions, I must know who you are. Not your names, they're simple. I'd like to know who. You are in relation to the late Monsieur de Vries. How did you get to be here? What were you to him? And he to you?" The visitors exchanged cautious glances. Lady Helena Marsh, stately in a rich burgundy gown that gave her the air of sadness even before her death, stood and walked to the center of the room. "I'll start," she responded, not as if she were volunteering, but as if she were seizing the role she felt she deserved. "I've known Maximilian for about 20 years. He and I were close pals at times. Sometimes we went months without speaking. He had mood swings, which I respected. Her voice was even, controlled. We both had a passion for antiquities. I provided a few things to his collection and occasionally curated for him. I arrived 3 days ago at his invitation." Poirot tilted his head. "Thank you, madam. And did you notice anything strange about his behavior? Fatigue, perhaps? A change?" "In routine." Lady Helena's lips twitched. "Maximilian was always weird, but nothing struck me. He seemed happy, even animated. He claimed to have acquired something rare." Poirot made no comment, only taking note of the phrase. Edward Langford took the next step closer, his gaze flitting from the floor to Poirot's polished shoes. He rubbed his palms together, uncomfortably. I came here at Max's request. Authenticate a pair of Phoenician tablets. I'm a manuscript scholar, you see, Cambridge. Well, formally." He coughed. "He had been corresponding with me for several weeks. They asked me to come softly. I arrived 2 nights ago." Poirot lifted his eyebrow. "And did you see these tablets?" Langford blinked. "No. He stored them in the basement archive. He claimed he wanted to expose them once the others had left. I thought that was odd." Poirot smiled softly. "Monsieur de Vries, he liked his drama, yes?" Langford managed a feeble laugh. "Yes, very." Now it was Solange Petit's time. She stayed, sat but maintained a tight stance. "I've been with Monsieur de Vries for about 12 years. I oversaw all inventories. I handled his correspondence. I'm the reason his collection hasn't crumbled into anarchy." Poirot nodded. "You were also here last night?" "Oui," she replied tightly. "I served the wine myself, from the cellar stock, as always. Max insisted on that particular bottle, Chateau Pavie 2001. A favorite of his. And did anyone else pour a glass?" Her lips narrowed. He poured the rest. "But only after I had opened it." "Monsieur Poirot, I know my work." Poirot took mental note of the defensiveness. It was not uncommon in those who maintained order in a world prone to chaos. Tomás Lucero had been standing at the back, hands in his pockets, head tilted. He stepped forward with a lazy elegance. I was the last to receive the invitation. Only met de Vries once before in Buenos Aires. He admired the necklace I appraised, and when we spoke again, he invited me to come. His warm, melodious accent slipped around his words. I did not expect to be in Switzerland this month, but who says no to de Vries? Poirot regarded him. And did he speak to you of what he recently acquired? Lucero nodded. He hinted, said it would cast all of his other valuables into shadows, but he wouldn't reveal what it was. Curious, Poirot remarked. Adriana de Vries finally stood up. She hadn't spoken anything till now, her silence weighted with suppressed emotion. She was in her early 40s, with dark eyes that had already witnessed disappointment. Her tone was measured, not warm or cold. I am his niece. To the best of my knowledge, he has only one living relative. My mom was his sister. She paused. We hadn't spoken in about 19 years. He severed off contact following a quarrel. But 3 weeks ago I got a letter, a long one. He stated that he wanted to make amends. Poirot nodded, his face inscrutable. And you believed this reconciliation was sincere? I didn't know, she replied simply, but I arrived. I arrived yesterday afternoon. And did he greet you as a fatherly uncle, or as a collector facing regret? She paused. He seems nervous, as if he didn't expect me to accept his invitation. Poirot folded his arms. And what about the others? Did they greet you warmly? Adriana's gaze shifted to Solange and Lady Helena. No, they did not. A silence fell over the room, like a covering of dust that no one wanted to wipe away. Poirot moved carefully to the decanter near the sideboard. It remained untouched beside the empty goblet. He examined it but did not raise it. Now, he added softly, I will ask one more question to each of you. He turned first to Helena. Madame, where were you from 10 to 11 yesterday night? I was in the garden salon, she explained effortlessly. Reading, alone. Poirot turned to Langford. I had gone into my room. I was not feeling well. To your room, on the west wing. Langford nodded. Solange? I was inside the cellar, checking the backup wine supply. I returned at 10:30. Lucero? He grinned slightly. Smoking on the balcony, overlooking the lake. And you, Mademoiselle de Vries? I was unpacking in the East guest suite. Poirot had no reaction. But Leclerc had taken down each statement. His brow wrinkled. Poirot, meantime, returned to the center of the room and examined the velvet-draped body beneath the linen. A collector, he mumbled, surrounded by valuable items. Killed not for what he possessed, but for what he knew. Perhaps for what he had threatened to give up. He turned to face the others. This place is full of dead things. But it is the living who fascinate me. His voice lowered, soft yet firm. One of you is lying, and before we dine tonight, I'll know who. A flicker moved across more than one face. Poirot's little grey cells were active. The dance had started. The hush that followed Poirot's announcement spread like a fresh coat of frost around the room. No one dared talk. A clock was ticking out in the distant. A bird called weakly beyond the window, its voice too free for a place filled with unsaid stress. Poirot straightened the crease on his cuff and turned to face Leclerc. We must begin, mon ami, with the simplest truths. The time, the sequence, the impressions. Leclerc cleared his throat, slightly flushed from being addressed in front of the guests. Yes, of course. The maid found the deceased around 7:20 this morning. She stated that the library door was closed but not locked. The lights were off. She came into dust and... He gestured faintly toward the linen-draped form. Discovered him like that. I came 40 minutes later. The doctor arrived shortly after 8 and confirmed that death occurred between 10 and midnight. Based on rigor, it's probably closer to 10:30. Poirot nodded slowly. And the wine glass? Was it moved? Leclerc shook his head. Not to our knowledge. We kept everything as it was. Poirot returned his eyes to the guests, his voice gentle yet sharp. Now it is an issue of precision. You see, when someone lies, the details come out. The truth is consistent, whereas lies fray. He turned slightly to face Solange, who sat again, clutching her notebook like a talisman. "Mademoiselle, you mentioned you were in the cellar last night. Can I ask why?" Solange raised her chin. "Because the inventory needed upgrading. Every 3 days I check the temperature and labels. Last night was one of those days." "Indeed. And no one accompanied you?" "No." "Did anyone see you descend?" She paused. "No. I informed Monsieur de Vries that I would go down after supper." He agreed. Poirot stepped away. "Excuse me, I am a creature of habit. When I walk around a house, I notice these things. The cellar door creaks, right?" "Quite bad." Solange did not respond quickly. "Yes," Leclerc said, frowning. "Loudly." "Then, perhaps," Poirot remarked gently, "someone would have heard it." "No?" Lucero responded with a casual shrug. "I did. But I believed she was returning upstairs, not going down." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Curious. Did you hear her return?" Lucero blinked. "No. But I was on the balcony." "And you, Lady Helena? Did you hear footsteps or the cellar door?" Lady Helena pushed a palm against her chest. "I believe I heard the door, a faint squeak, but I was not timing anyone's moves." "Ah, but the ear picks up on things that the eyes miss," Poirot said with a faint smile. He then turned towards Adriana. She hadn't moved since her previous statement, and her stillness was no longer one of control, but rather something more internal, unwilling. "Mademoiselle," Poirot remarked gently, "you said you were unpacking. Has anyone seen you?" "No." "You were in the East Suite?" "Yes." Poirot turned to Leclerc. "This room, it does not have a lock on the inside, but it is the only guest room with a view of the rear gardens, no?" Leclerc nodded. "That's correct. Why?" Poirot gave a slight shrug. "Observation. Only. One can see the approach to the library windows from there." Adriana looked up in surprise. "You did not happen to glance out last night?" "No," she replied, gently yet firmly. "I was thinking of your uncle." She didn't respond. Poirot turned, with almost theatrical ease, toward Edward Langford, who was twitching slightly with the wish not to be spoken to. "Monsieur Langford, the room in which you stayed, it is above the west wing?" Langford nodded. "Yes." "And you mentioned feeling ill. Did you call for help?" "No, I just went to bed." "Strange, is it not, how illness can come upon one precisely when a man dies?" Langford flinched slightly. "I was just tired. I had a headache." Poirot regarded him for a while longer, then moved back and crossed his arms. "So we have 5 people, none with a valid alibi, all within reach of the poisoned goblet. However, none of you witnessed the critical moment." His gaze shifted to the large cabinet behind the desk, polished mahogany with brass inlay. The door was ajar. Poirot approached it and opened it gently. Inside, there were other crystal goblets. That looked exactly like the ones on the floor. "Ah," he murmured gently, "a collection even of glasses, a man who values consistency even in his drinkware." Solange cleared her throat. "He insisted that each guest use a different glass." "It was a minor affectation." Poirot turned. "And who chose his glass last night? She..." Paused. "Yes, he did. He always did." Poirot lowered his voice. "And was the wine already poured when the others entered?" "No," she confessed. "He poured it himself, from the bottle I opened." "A man confident in his control," Poirot remarked. Leclerc stepped forward. "So the poison was in the bottle?" Poirot halted. "It's plausible. However, this seems implausible. Only Maximilian drank from it, right?" Solange nodded. "Yes, no one else owned the Chateau Pavie. The rest had white." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then the poison was special to him." "Very specific." Lucero shifted. "But if no one touched his glass, how—" Poirot's eyes blazed. "Monsieur Lucero, I did not state no one had touched it. I said he spilled it. However, it is possible that it was prepared previously." He turned back to face the guests. There was, I believe, an opportunity. A moment after dinner, Solange was inside the cellar. Langford claims to be inside his room. The rest were alone, each one easily unseen. His voice became sharper. But someone entered the room, someone who knew he was going to take that precise glass. Someone poisoned it in advance, perhaps while pretending to enjoy the collection. The weight of his words settled on them. "And now I will do what I do best," Poirot murmured softly. "I'll wait, not idle, never idle. I'll be watching. The murderer is not calm, not really. They'll slip. And I, Hercule Poirot, will be watching." Without waiting for an answer, he went to Leclerc and mumbled something inaudible. Then, with a slight nod to the others, he moved gently to the door. Adriana's voice interrupted the silence. "Do you really think one of us did it?" Poirot hesitated, with his hand on the doorframe. "I think," he replied, "that in every room full of secrets the shadows do not just fall. They cling," and with that he left, leaving 5 suspects in a room where silence no longer felt secure. The corridor beyond the library was small, lined with gloomy sconces, and painted in faded greys and olives from a bygone period. Poirot moved. Carefully, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, his polished sneakers barely making a sound on the patterned ground. Inspector Leclerc followed in his footsteps, scrolling over his notes with nervous eagerness. "She's lying, you know," Leclerc said under his breath. "The curator." Solange. "That practice of checking labels at night? A little too neat and prepared." Poirot did not break stride. "Ah, perhaps, mon ami, but you are eager. Suspicion is not equivalent to guilt. Mademoiselle Solange, she may lie. However, the falsehood may conceal something other than murder." Leclerc frowned. "You think she's protecting someone?" Poirot cast a peek at him. "I believe she is sheltering herself from embarrassment, perhaps, or from being perceived as disloyal. But murder, that I don't know yet." They entered the antechamber from the main hallway. The room was simply furnished, but a single marble bust of a worn and cold-eyed Roman senator peered over it like a silent judge. Poirot stopped beneath it. "I want to see the cellar," he stated simply. Leclerc blinked. "The wine cellar." Poirot gave a small nod. "Where Mademoiselle Solange claims to have spent last night. I'm not thirsty for wine, Leclerc. I'm thirsty for confirmation." They were escorted by a maid, one of the quiet, uniformed servants who glided around the villa like ghosts, to a narrow stairs at the back of the home. The steps were stone, worn smooth in the center, and the air became cooler as we descended. A metal door led into the cellar proper, a long space with low beams and red brick arches, rows of bottle racks reaching out like a subterranean library of its own. Poirot breathed forcefully through his nostrils. "The air is clear but tinged with corkenage. There is no scent of strychnine. That is okay." Leclerc approached a clipboard hanging from a nail. Inventory log. Solange's handwriting. Poirot cast a peek at it. Each line was meticulously dated, annotated with location marks and temperature measurements. He brushed a finger softly over the dusty shelf edge. "A perfectionist, no?" he mused. "I am a detail-oriented woman. Her handwriting, her work, she requires the world to align." Leclerc scanned the racks. There are no shattered bottles or disheveled shelves. Nothing is out of order. Poirot nodded. "Precisely. However, order can be deceptive. Sometimes it is too perfect." He pointed to a rack labeled Chateau Pavie. "This vintage, the same as that which was served last night?" Leclerc checked the entry. "Yes. 12 bottles, one removed, tagged, and dated." Poirot inspected the shelf. There was a faint impression of dust where the lost bottle had been. "And yet," he said quietly, "there is no smudge, no error, as if her hands were never genuinely present last night at all." Leclerc stepped back. "So she lied?" Poirot tilted his head. "She may have intended to come down. She may have assured herself she would come down. But I think something diverted her. They left the cellar in thoughtful silence. Back upstairs, the mansion had settled. Into the tense calm that comes after an emotional storm. Poirot requested to be shown to the study, Maximilien de Vries' secret retreat. Leclerc unlocked it, and they went inside. If the library had been a public museum of De Vries' taste, the study was its intimate counterpart, darker, moodier, with fewer artifacts but more personalized curation. A little desk sat alongside a fireplace, and behind it a leather-bound ledger was open. Poirot went straight to it. Inside there were pages filled with private acquisition notes, personal remarks, and, interestingly, sealed envelopes placed into a leather pouch attached to the inner cover. Poirot took one and read the label aloud. "To be opened in the event of my death." He stared at Leclerc. The inspector gave a brief nod. Poirot carefully opened the letter. It was handwritten in an elegant but slightly shaky script, possibly recent. His eyes surveyed the contents, and his countenance shifted not with alarm but with quiet delight. He did not speak the contents aloud, but slipped the letter into his pocket. He turned to face the fireplace. Poirot delicately stirred the ashes, which were still dark, with a poker. A few blackened bits emerged, one resembling the corner of a snapshot and another a torn envelope. He bent low and plucked them from the desk drawer with tweezers. "Someone burned something," Leclerc explained, leaning in. "Oui. And not long before the murder, I would guess. Look here. The ink is not completely burned. See this?" He held up. The edge of what had previously been an envelope. "The seal is De Vries, but it's not his handwriting." "Someone sent him something?" Poirot straightened. "Yes." And this scared him. They were disturbed by the sound of light, unsure footfall in the doorway. It was Adriana. "I'm sorry," she replied. "I didn't mean to intrude. I wanted to ask something." Poirot turned to her and motioned for her to enter. "Please, mademoiselle." She walked inside but remained close to the door, her gaze drawn to the desk. "I hope to read over some of his papers. Please provide any explanations on why he asked me here." Poirot remained silent for a moment, while observing her. "He told you nothing?" She shakes her head. "Only that he regretted what had happened to my mother. He said he wanted to see me." Poirot nodded. "And did you believe him?" "I wanted to." "Were you close, as a child?" She paused. "It's not close. But he used to send me postcards whenever he traveled. I preserved them all. And then one day they stopped." Poirot examined her closely. "He was a man in possession, mademoiselle. When he contributed something, affection, attention, he expected it to be his. Perhaps your mother questioned that." "She did," Adriana replied coldly. "She accused him of stealing from her, something to do with inheritance." "Did he?" "I don't know." Poirot nodded again, slowly. "He was not a man who parted easily with anything." She looked away, her arms tightly crossed. "You think someone here killed him for something he wouldn't give up?" Poirot moved closer. "I assume he was about to give something away, something the killer couldn't afford to lose." Adriana furrowed her brow. "You mean, like an object?" "No," Poirot replied gently. "I mean a truth." Her countenance transformed, halfway between realization and dread. Poirot gave her a kind smile. "Don't be concerned, mademoiselle. Despite her patience, she is never silent." She nodded slightly and exited. The room, Leclerc still standing by the hearth, exhaled gently. "That girl. She's also hiding something." Poirot glanced toward the window. The lake was motionless and gloomy under the veiled sun. His reflection in the glass appeared to glitter against the distant waters. "They all are," he said. "Each of them is clutching something just out of view. But the pattern Leclerc is beginning to form, it's like a mosaic. To view the whole picture, you must take a step back." He tapped the sealed packet in his pocket and looked toward the door. "And I think," he said almost to himself, "that it is time to disturb the calm." Without saying anything, he turned on his heel and walked out of the room, his strides quickening as if the pace of the riddle had changed. A whisper had begun to echo in the caverns of his mind, something half-formed, like the edge of a recollection waiting to be declared. The killer had touched something, perhaps quickly and without thinking, but enough. Poirot would discover it not with magnifying lenses or fingerprints, but with the quiet, unwavering confidence of his small grey cells. The sun had begun to set behind the hills beyond Lake Geneva, bathing the villa in gold and silver light late in the afternoon. Shadows extended long along the parquet floors, and the air inside the collector's shadow became thicker, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Poirot went purposefully along the corridors, no longer drifting. The time for quiet observation was over. The pieces were aligning, not the entire picture, mind you, but enough of the edges had formed to suggest that something valuable and possibly incriminating was hiding in plain sight. He entered the drawing room where the guests had assembled again, more out of habit than by invitation. Leclerc stood, discreetly in the corner, speaking gently to a gendarme stationed at the door, while Solange sat stiffly on a short couch, her arms folded like one of the statues she had meticulously documented. Lady Helena rested against the fireplace, twirling the remnants of a glass of white wine, her stance comfortable but her gaze piercing beneath her drooping eyelashes. Lucero sat in a velvet chair with an expression of studied disinterest, while Adriana stood at the window, arms crossed, half looking at the lake and partly turning away. Langford was glaringly absent. Poirot arrived without preamble. "I have requested that dinner be delayed," he said kindly, "for I believe that before we break bread again, we must first break silence." The room responded with a subtle temperature shift, stiffened backs, adjusted collars, and swift glances from Lucero to Helena, Helena to Adriana. "There is no evidence," stated Lucero, the first to object. "You're guessing, Inspector." Poirot smiled weakly. "Ah, Monsieur Lucero, but you misunderstand me as someone who seeks evidence in the classic sense. I am not a man with fingerprints or fibers. I deal with contradictions. And they, how could I put it, have begun to dance before my eyes." He then turned towards Lady Helena. "You mentioned last night that you read in the garden salon, alone." She nodded and took a slow sip. "That's correct." Poirot's brow rose. "Curious. The maid who cleans that room in the morning claims she discovered no book. There's no cigarette tray either. And yet, you are a smoker, right?" Helena's expression stiffened slightly. "I may have gone outside briefly. Is that so unusual?" "Not at all," Poirot replied. "However, the French doors were found unfastened this morning. De Vries was meticulous about locking every door at night. One would infer he did so after you entered the salon, unless, of course, you entered after he died." Nobody breathed. For a moment, as the words hung in the air, Helena placed her glass gently. "What are you accusing me of, exactly?" "Going for a stroll?" Poirot shakes his head. "I am not accusing anyone. I'm only noting that the timeline wobbles, and when the timeline sways, it's typically because someone has their finger on the clock." Solange, who had been silently furious, spoke with clipped precision. "And what about Langford?" "He is not here." "No," Poirot agreed. "Which is precisely why I must speak to him next." He looked to Leclerc and nodded once. Within moments, a young cop was dispatched. Poirot restored his focus to the group. "I've got one more observation. Monsieur de Vries deliberately chose the bottle of wine served last night, Chateau Pavie. Solange stated that it was opened and served in his presence. However, when investigated, the bottle reveals traces of having been opened earlier, albeit minimally. Enough to insert a needle." "The cork doesn't sit flush." Solange's face blanched. "Impossible. I opened it myself. I verified the seal." "Are you certain?" Poirot asked kindly. "Or did you see what you expected to see?" She opened her lips to speak before closing it again. At that point, the door opened, and Edward Langford entered, pallid and disheveled, with a sheen of sweat on his brow. Poirot turned slowly. "Ah, Monsieur Langford, how nice of you to join us." Langford's voice was faint. "I wasn't aware we were required. Let's call it an opportunity to sweep away shadows. I am curious, monsieur, why you claim to have gone to your room so early last night." "I wasn't feeling well," Langford responded, peering around uneasily. "I already said that." "Indeed. However, the housekeeper reports that your lamp remained on until beyond 11 p.m., and your suitcase was discovered this morning half-packed." Langford seemed shocked. What of it?" Poirot took a step closer, his voice becoming lower, sharper. "You were planning to leave." Langford swallowed. "It was a precaution. After the body was discovered, non, monsieur. The case was disrupted before the death was discovered. You intended to leave before the murder was discovered, Langford stammered as his hand trembled. That is ludicrous. I had no explanation. No, Poirot replied quietly. Even if Maximilien de Vries recently told you that he had questions regarding the genuineness of the Phoenician tablets, he suspected you of passing off a forgery. Langford's mouth opened and then slammed shut. Ah, Poirot remarked with a sympathetic tone. You know, I have read the letter he sent to his counsel. It wasn't only about his niece. He intended to modify his will and take legal action against the person who had tricked him. You, monsieur. Langford. Langford fell into the nearest chair, hands in his lap. He told me he would not make it public. He said he'd give me time. Poirot's voice was calm. And yet you feared what would happen when the truth came out. Langford looked up, defiant now. I didn't kill him. Perhaps not, Poirot acknowledged. However, you had a motive, and you lied about your location. That makes you suspicious. Langford looked down, disheartened. Poirot cast a glance to the others. Each of you had something to lose, or something to gain, but only one of you had both, and the opportunity. He began pacing slowly. There was something de Vries mentioned. In passing, to Adriana, he wanted to make apologies. He invited her here to heal a wound, and there is evidence, yes, proof, that he intended to amend his will to give a sizable piece of his assets to her. Adriana widened her eyes but did not say anything. Poirot turned to Helena. That would have changed everything, wouldn't it, Lady Helena, especially for someone who believed she had already been guaranteed a position in his legacy. Helena's jaw stiffened. I never asked for anything. No, Poirot said, his voice silky as silk, but you expected it, and he decided to bestow it elsewhere. You're wrong, am I? Poirot studied her. I think you challenged him last night. I believe he told you about his plans, and I assume you know where he kept his own wine collection and favorite glass. You had access, the knowledge, the resentment. Lady Helena remained immobile, hands curled at her sides. You didn't intend to kill him, not at first, Poirot said. Perhaps you merely intended to scare him. But strychnine, it leaves no space for deliberation. The room held its breath. Then she laughed, short, harsh, and without amusement. You think I would poison him over a change of heart? She inquired harshly. He shattered hearts for sport. Mine, Solange's, maybe even Adriana's. That man did not know how to contribute, only how to take. Poirot tilted his head. And when someone finally took from him, it was more than he could survive. Lady Helena's eyes held his for a long time. Then she fell softly into the chair alongside Langford, her expression unreadable. I didn't poison him, she explained softly. Poirot gave a slight somber nod. Maybe not, but I think you know who did. And with that, quiet fell again, this time more heavily. Outside, the last light had slipped behind the lake. The shadows lengthened, in earnest. And the center of the mystery, its stinging, dazzling core, was one step closer to being exposed. A clock struck 6 someplace deep within the villa, with each chime being accurate, hollow, and slow. Poirot did not respond quickly. He let the silence extend, watching as it wrapped around the room like a tightening ribbon. Nobody dared move. The atmosphere was no longer just uncomfortable, it was brittle, as if one more accusation might fracture the entire atmosphere. Lady Helena remained seated beside Langford, arms folded in a position of acquiescence rather than protest. Langford glanced at the floor, his hands loosely clasped. Solange remained seated firmly on the settee, but her eyes twitched with something less rigid, uncertainty, perhaps, or terror. Lucero had leaned forward slightly, one ankle crossing, across his knee, as if striving to retake control of the narrative by position alone. Adriana remained by the window, half in shadow, her profile reflecting the amber dusk that was now fading across the lake. Poirot approached the fireplace with deliberate slowness and stood in front of it, his back to the flames and hands resting on the lapels of his suit. He looked at each of them carefully, his expression opaque. There is one thing I must tell you, he said softly. Murder does not live in a vacuum. This is not an isolated incident. It's a crescendo. the culmination of a lengthy, often silent piece, he directed his focus to Solange. "For example, mademoiselle, you said you were in the cellar. Nonetheless, you made no record in the inventory log. That is unlike you. You take pride in precision." "Did anything interrupt you?" Solange's lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she replied, barely above a whisper. "I hear voices upstairs. People raised their voices. I was ashamed to listen." Poirot tilted his head. "Are there raised voices? Between whom?" A pause. "Maximilian and Lady Helena," she announced. All heads turned. Helena exhaled sharply, but did not deny it. "Yes," she replied, her tone dry. "He told me he was leaving part of the collection to Adriana, and that I should stop thinking I was part of the furniture." "And how did you respond?" Poirot asked kindly. "I threw a vase." Poirot's eyes lit. "Ah, a detail you neglected before. Which vase?" Helena's mouth twitched. "One of the Ming reproductions, not an original." Poirot offered a slight nod. "Still, destruction of property, unlike you, but emotional disorder can provoke strange behaviors." Helena shrugged. "He knew how to wound." Poirot glanced at Leclerc, who had silently re-entered during the exchange. "You see, mon ami, how useful it is to dig beneath the first statements. Truth comes not all at once, but in layers." Then Poirot turned his attention slowly toward Thomas Lucero. "You, monsieur," he said, "have been very quiet. Too quiet, I think, for a man so accustomed to speaking his way through difficult circumstances." Lucero raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I looked into your arrival," Poirot continued. "You claim De Vries invited you to appraise certain gems, but no record of any recent acquisitions appears in his personal logbook, nor in the sealed letters to his solicitor." Lucero gave a faint smile. "Maybe it was a private matter. Maybe he wanted discretion. Perhaps. Or perhaps you were not here to examine a gem, but to reclaim one." That got a reaction. Lucero stiffened. Poirot's voice was still calm, but his words moved with precision now, like chess pieces locking into position. "Years ago, in Buenos Aires, a sapphire went missing, one known as the Night's Eye, a rare piece traced back to the Samanid hordes. A collector of great reputation purchased it, believing it to be legitimate. That collector was, of course, Maximilian de Vries, but it was never seen again. Vanished. From public record." "I know nothing about that," Lucero said quickly. "Don't you?" Poirot spoke. "Because I think you do. I think de Vries discovered it was a stolen piece, and I think he knew who had planted it in the trade circuit." "You?" Lucero's mouth opened, closed. "He had no proof. Yet he invited you here," Poirot said. "Why?" Lucero hesitated. "He said he wanted to make a deal." "There it is," Poirot said softly. "And yet no such deal is recorded. I believe that is because it never happened. I believe he changed his mind. Perhaps he told you as much. Perhaps you realized you would leave here with your name tarnished, and perhaps you saw another solution. That's—" Lucero stopped himself. Everyone was watching him now. "I didn't kill him," he said after a pause, more controlled. "You're building stories from ashes." "Ah," Poirot replied gently. "But ashes, remember." He turned toward Adriana now. Her eyes met his, steadily. "You have been quiet, mademoiselle," he said, "but I believe there is something you have not yet said." She stepped forward slightly. "I didn't think it mattered." Poirot's tone was calm. "Everything matters." She glanced once at the others, then back at him. "Last night, after dinner, my uncle asked me to meet him in his study. He said he had something to show me, a letter from his lawyer. He said he was going to change the will, that he wanted me to carry on the collection, to turn it into something more open." Poirot nodded. "And did he show you this letter?" "No." "He said he'd locked it away." Poirot's gaze hardened. "Locked it where?" "In the desk drawer. He kept the key on his watch chain." Leclerc stiffened. Poirot turned to him. "You found the watch?" Leclerc nodded. "Yes, broken. The chain was snapped. But no key." Poirot looked around the room. So the key to the drawer containing the revised will, is missing. How curious. He stepped toward the fireplace once more and looked down at the remains he had found there earlier, the blackened edges of a document, and something more. He now pulled from his pocket a sliver of twisted brass. The remains of a small key, he said, recovered from the ashes. Everyone in the room stared. He tried to burn the letter. Adriana asked faintly. Poirot turned his eyes on her. No, mademoiselle, he did not. Someone else did. Someone who had access to the study after he died. Someone who searched his body, found the key, unlocked the drawer, read the letter, and knew they had to erase it. He swept his gaze across the group. The question is, who? But before anyone could speak, Leclerc took a step forward. Monsieur Poirot, he said, his voice tight. There's something else. One of the maids came forward. She saw someone enter the study after midnight. She thought it odd because the lights were already out. Poirot did not react. And who did she see? Leclerc looked grim. Langford. All heads turned. Langford looked up, startled. What? That's not true. Poirot's eyes were icy now. The tenderness had vanished. You were observed, monsieur. The bag in your room included not only your clothes, but also other wrapped goods, including an ancient coin set that matches one recently, removed from de Vries's locked display. Langford paled. I didn't poison him, he said softly. I didn't. He was dead when I arrived, I swear it. You only what? Poirot pushed. I panicked, Langford explained, his voice breaking. I figured if I took something it wouldn't go to waste. I believed he had betrayed me. When I saw the body, I was unable to think. I went to the study, found the key on the chain, and read the letter. When I realized what it meant, I destroyed it. Silence. Poirot nodded. So you're guilty, but not of murder. Theft, deception, and cowardice, but not the act itself. Langford appeared unwell. Then who? Poirot turned slowly, his voice softening again. That, said the man, is what I shall reveal tomorrow morning. He folded his hands. Now we let the night pass, and the guilty will not sleep well. And with that he left, leaving them in the shadows once more. Morning came slowly into the mansion, filtering through the big windows in a haze of pearl-grey light. The lake beyond was still, barren and unreadable, and there was no talk, breakfast, laughing or monotonous footfall echoing over the parquet floors within the collector's shadow. Only silence, taut and waiting. Poirot was already seated in the large salon when the guests were summoned. The space had been gently changed, with chairs arranged in a semicircle, no table to separate and no glass to distract. Leclerc stood near the doorway, arms folded, his expression unreadable but alert. And Kopp hovered in the background, unobtrusive, yet present. The 5 remaining visitors arrived slowly and nervously, each taking their seat with a stiffness that indicated a restless night. Solange's hair was pinned more tightly than normal. Helena's scarf was properly knotted, but her lipstick was pale. Langford looked exhausted, his hands trembling slightly. Lucero strode in with his customary swagger, but it was tattered around the edges. Adriana arrived last, her posture straight but her eyes shadowed. Poirot stood and bowed politely. Mesdames, Messieurs, thank you for your punctuality. I asked you to meet this morning so that I could relieve you of the burden that has hung over this house since Maximilien de Vries' murder. The words spoken so plainly produced the desired result. There was a subtle shift, shoulders tensed, glances exchanged. Poirot allowed the moment to settle before continuing. Over the past 2 days, I have listened, I have observed, I have noted the contradictions, the omissions, the too precise answers and the too vague ones, and I have come to a conclusion, not one based on physical evidence, no, for such things are prone to manipulation, but on psychology, on motive, and on behavior. He walked slowly before them now, hands clasped lightly behind his back. We begin with what we know. Monsieur de Vries died of strychnine poisoning, delivered via a glass of Chateau Pavie wine, poured by his own hand from a bottle selected by him. A bottle, it seems, that had been tampered with in advance. The cork was reseated. This required time, foresight, and, more importantly, Knowledge. Knowledge of his habits, his favorite vintage, his ritual of choosing that exact bottle. He stopped before Solange. You, mademoiselle, had access to the wine cellar. You knew every bottle. You say you opened the wine in his presence and poured, but, in fact, you only opened the bottle. He poured for himself, that is crucial. You did not pour the poison, no, but you could have prepared the bottle earlier. Solange met his eyes without flinching. If I had wanted to kill him, I would not have used such a method. It's messy, loud. Strychnine is violent. Just so, Poirot said gently. You prefer order, precision. You may have disliked him, but you did not kill him. He moved to Langford. Monsieur, your guilt lies elsewhere. Theft, cowardice, the destruction of a letter that could have redeemed a name, but not the murder. You panicked. You are not a killer. Langford exhaled audibly, head bowed. Poirot turned next to Lady Helena. You, madame, had cause. He wounded your pride, your expectations, and your heart. But in your anger you threw a vase. You acted impulsively. The poison, no, that requires planning, calculation. Your violence is loud, not hidden. Helena arched an eyebrow but said nothing. Poirot turned to Lucero. And you, monsieur, a thief, yes. A deceiver, without question. But I believe your game is survival. You play with shadows, but you do not kill for legacy. You kill for necessity. And in this case, you were too exposed. Too late. Lucero smirked faintly, but it didn't reach. His eyes? Then Poirot turned to Adriana. He paused, then walked to the center of the room and faced her directly. Mademoiselle, he said quietly, I must speak to you last. She sat still, saying nothing. You came here at your uncle's invitation after decades of estrangement. You were offered reconciliation, perhaps redemption. But what he offered was not love, it was control. He summoned you not to give you anything, but to demand your return on his terms. Adriana's hands tightened in her lap. You say he spoke of changing his will, of passing the legacy to you. But there is something you did not say. Something I believe only became clear to you when you arrived. Poirot's voice dropped to a murmur. You were not the only one he contacted. Adriana looked up sharply. He wrote to your mother. The original heir. He sought to bring her back, not you, but she refused. And so he settled for the second best. A niece instead of a sister. You were not the heir by affection. You were the heir by default. Adriana's eyes widened. How do you know that? Because I found a second letter, hidden in the back of his solicitor's ledger. A reply, returned unopened, marked, refused. No further contact. It was addressed to your mother, dated a week before yours. The room was still. Poirot continued softly. And I believe that when you arrived here full of hope, only to realize that he was using you, again, you snapped. You remembered the childhood wounds, the betrayal, the man who cast your mother aside and treated you as an afterthought. And you knew one thing with absolute clarity, that nothing he gave would be without a price. That if he changed his will, it was not a gift, it was a leash. Adriana stood abruptly. That's not true. Poirot's voice was calm. You had the knowledge. You had the motive. You had access to the cellar the day before. I believe you slipped in when Solange was away. I believe you watched your uncle's routine and prepared the bottle, knowing he would select it. I didn't. Poirot lifted his hand. You killed him, mademoiselle. Not out of greed, not even out of revenge, but to free yourself, to break the last thread tying you to a man who never truly loved you, who kept you dangling like one of his treasures, catalogued but never cherished. Adriana was trembling now. No, she whispered. Poirot moved closer. But then, guilt. It arrived quickly, no? You didn't mean to become a murderer. You only wanted escape, but strychnine, it makes escape impossible. It forces you to witness your crime. You saw him die in agony, and afterward, you said nothing, because it was too late. She stared at him, tears forming but not falling. Her voice cracked. He ruined my mother. He let us suffer. He hoarded everything, even kindness. Poirot said nothing. I wanted him to feel powerless, she whispered. Just once. Just for once. The room was silent. Poirot offered a Slight nod. And so he did. Leclerc stepped forward. Adriana didn't resist as she was quietly taken aside, nor did she speak again. The others watched in stunned quiet. Poirot remained still for a moment longer, then turned to the rest of them. "It is finished," he said. "Not neatly, not happily, but truthfully." He looked once more out toward the lake. "Murder," he murmured, "is rarely about hatred. More often it is about silence, the silence one can no longer bear." And then, with the air of a man who had merely tidied a disorderly room, Hercule Poirot adjusted his cuffs, straightened his tie, and walked out into the soft morning light. Poirot's movements were quiet as he walked down the corridor toward the study again, but his mind remained active. Though the case appeared to be closed, the confession was extracted, the motivation was revealed, and the killer was identified. One thread remained unanswered, coiled in the back of his mind like an untied ribbon. Adriana's dying words rang, out with too much clarity. I wanted him to feel powerless. It was expressed in the tone of someone who truly believed it, not as justification, but as an explanation. Nonetheless, despite the emotional resonance, Poirot felt it. The slightest friction of something unsaid, not untruth, but omission. This type of omission is motivated by protection rather than guilt. There is a shadow behind the truth. He went inside the study and closed the door behind him. The morning light filtered softly across the floors, lighting the items on Maximilien de Vries' desk, a brass magnifying glass, a letter opener curved like a dagger, and a half-filled inkwell. He returned to the drawer where the amended will had previously been hidden. The key had been destroyed in the fireplace, rendering the contents lost, until Langford's late-night robbery. However, there had been more within than Langford claimed. Poirot was certain of it. He knelt and studied the drawer once more. This time he completely removed it, taking the compartment out of the desk. Beneath it, barely visible in the shadows, was a second fake bottom, thin and cleverly designed. He pressed the side with his index finger. It gave slightly, and then released. Inside was a thin velvet envelope. Poirot carefully unfurled it on the desk. Inside were 3 items: a photograph, old, faded, but unmistakably of a younger Maximilien de Vries, with a woman and a child on a beach, a handwritten letter, unsigned, but unmistakably penned by Maximilien's hand, and, most curious of all, a folded page from a Sotheby's catalogue, marked with a red X across a page featuring an ancient Mesopotamian seal. Poirot read the letter slowly. It wasn't addressed to Adriana, but to her mother. "I harmed you, and I have no defense. I kept what was yours and convinced myself I was preserving history. I was conserving myself. But you were correct. That seal was never in my collection. It belonged to your father. You trusted me. I betrayed the trust. It is time to return it. I've ordered my solicitor to handle the transfer. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to delete the ledger before it shuts." Poirot folded the letter slowly. He sat back in his chair, contemplating. The seal. So in his final days, de Vries sought to reinvent restitution as well as inheritance. Something he'd stolen long ago. Something buried beneath his large and twisted collection. No guest had acknowledged. The Mesopotamian seal, and no paperwork had identified it. However, he had marked it. I meant to return it. Someone else had learned about this objective. A door opened behind him. It was Leclerc. "Everything is prepared," he said. "Adriana has been taken into custody. She hasn't said anything since." Poirot turned in his chair. "She will not speak. Not because she is proud, but she is afraid." Leclerc frowned. "Afraid?" Poirot taps the envelope. "Tell me, my buddy, do you believe her motive, that she killed her uncle to get independence?" Leclerc crossed his arms. "It suits. Emotionally." "At least, yes," Poirot replied gently. "But not exactly. She isn't impulsive. Strychnine, as you noted, is a terrible approach. It is not for the faint-hearted." Leclerc researched him. "Then you think—" "What?" Poirot stood and paced towards the window. "She did not poison the wine," he explained, "but she believes she did." Leclerc blinked. "That's absurd. She confessed. She admitted her purpose, definitely, to resentment, to opportunity. But I've seen confessions of all types, mon ami. Not all of them are correct. He turned sharply. Langford feared being exposed. Helena dreaded erasure. Solange feared chaos. Lucero feared discovery. But Adriana feared becoming him. This was her burden. Not the act. Leclerc's brow wrinkled. Then who? Poirot stepped over to the far cabinet in the study, which was filled with coin sets and Assyrian fragments. He pointed to a sealed display at the bottom. Do you recall the coin set that was nearly stolen? Leclerc nodded. Langford was trying to smuggle it out. Correct. However, there was something else missing. A seal. It had been catalogued but not shown. Solange's inventory indicated that it should have been in a side drawer. It was not. Leclerc narrowed his eyes. So it was taken. No, Poirot replied calmly. It was never meant to be seen again. He went back to the letter and tapped the Sotheby's clipping. De Vries intended to return this object. Finally, he attempted to remedy something horrible. But someone was concerned about what might be disclosed with that return. Poirot's voice lowered. Someone who had benefited from the theft. Leclerc's eyes widened. Lucero? Poirot nodded slowly. It suits. A dealer. A middleman. Someone who helped. De Vries laundered a relic many years ago and was concerned that it would reappear with documentation attached. His invitation to the villa was not coincidental. De Vries summoned him to pay restitution. But Lucero recognized the reality before anyone else, that if De Vries went ahead, it would implicate him. Leclerc stepped back. So Lucero poisoned him? Yes. But not with rage, with calm calculations. He likely prepared the bottle before Adriana came. He allowed family conflicts to escalate, allowed Helena to dispute, Langford to panic, and Adriana to dislike. Everybody had a reason to appear guilty, and when Adriana made her move, entering the study, hurt and confused, Lucero saw an opportunity. He let her believe it. Leclerc, muttered. Poirot nodded gravely. And now she sits in custody, convinced she caused a death she merely wished for. Leclerc clenched his jaw. We need to get him in now. Wait, Poirot replied, lifting his hand. Not yet. He should not suspect. He moved closer and lowered his voice. Tell the staff to plan a last gathering. 1 hour, same salon. This time we completed the game properly. Leclerc gave a quick nod and disappeared down the hall. Poirot stayed in the study for a long time after, listening to the creak of the ancient wood and the silence of a house that had seen too much. Then, with a breath that seemed to recenter the world, he folded the letter, placed it into his inner pocket and returned to the room where each mask would fall. The end was near. But before it arrived, the truth earned its moment. Incomplete. The salon had been rearranged once more, with chairs arranged in a tight circle beneath the chandelier's wan glow, and the windows closed to keep out the lake's apathetic shimmer. The air within had become heavy with anticipation, as if the very walls strained to hear what Hercule Poirot would say next. He entered the room with his usual precision, his grey suit pressed, his shoes polished to a mirror-like shine, and his demeanour unreadable but tranquil. Lucero was already sat, legs crossed, the tip of his polished shoe tapping idly on the carpet. His posture was beautiful and casual, yet his eyes were sharp beneath his half-lidded look. The others followed shortly after. Langford stepped in, bent, his humiliation hanging to him like an ill-fitting coat. Helena moved with regal exhaustion, her posture rigid, despite the shadows beneath her eyes. Solange entered last, arms crossed tightly and expression impassive, but her gaze never left Poirot's. Leclerc stood by the door as usual, arms behind his back. A second officer waited in the hallway. Poirot had begged that Adriana not be present. Not yet. Poirot moved to the center of the group and bowed gently. Merci, he said softly. You're all exhausted. You're probably wondering why I'm summoning you again now that the mystery appears to be solved. Mademoiselle Adriana de Vries has been arrested for allegedly poisoning her uncle. A confession was made. Yeah. A motive is presented. The logic behind the act, as we understand it, was one of escape. One might say, of freedom. He started walking gently down the arc of the room. But I have learned in all my years that the Truth, she does not always wear the face we expect. She sometimes hides behind the anticipated, the emotions, the human. He stopped near Lucero and turned slightly. And sometimes she is replaced by something else, something convenient. Lucero looked up. You're saying the confession is false? Poirot's voice was calm. I am saying the confession was incomplete. Solange's lips moved slightly, but she didn't say anything. Langford's hand twitched. Helena just narrowed her gaze. Poirot moved again. You see, Adriana thought she was responsible. She hoped it, even if she didn't do anything. Her guilt, while misguided, was sincere. But there was something she didn't. No, something that did not fit into the nice emotional picture she provided. He dug into his coat and pulled the fading envelope he discovered beneath the false drawer. He cautiously unwrapped the contents and placed them on the table in the center of the circle, the photograph, the Sotheby's page, and the note. This, he added slowly, is the reality Maximilien de Vries tried to bury, and in the dying days of his life attempted to exhume. A stolen seal, taken decades ago, belonging to his sister's family rather than his own, to Adriana's mother. He turned toward Helena. Madame, you were right in your judgment. Maximilien wasn't a generous man. He hoarded apologies as much as objects. But this was his attempt at restitution. Poirot's gaze swept the room. However, it was also a threat, because once the seal was returned, questions would be raised, documents were evaluated, sales were traced. And in that deep shadow another man stood, one who assisted in the deal, a man who made it disappear from public record and profited from its quiet. Lucero's face remained still, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Poirot's voice was steady. We were not invited to this villa on a whim. De Vries summoned you here, Monsieur Lucero, for a quiet reckoning. He never meant to expose you publicly, but he intended to break the tie, to return the object, to name his crime, and in doing so name yours. Lucero tilted his head slightly. That's speculation, Poirot nodded. That would be correct. If not for this. He dug into his pocket once more and pulled out a second sheet, a photocopy of a bank transaction made to a numbered account in Zurich. De Vries's solicitor confirmed that this sum was transferred to you the day after he retrieved the seal. I assume the payment was for silence, or maybe guilt. But something has changed. The day before his death, he directed his lawyers to discontinue the payments. He was about to return the item. Poirot came closer, his tone still calm. And then he got poisoned. Strychnine causes an excruciating, noisy death. However, it was cleverly administered, in a bottle of his own choosing. He poured a glass by hand. Only someone who understood his routines well could assure that he alone received the medication. And only the one who stood to lose everything if the truth was revealed had the incentive to strike first. He turned his full attention to Lucero. I suspect you tampered with the bottle the previous afternoon, while Solange was occupied. I assume you spent your time on the balcony, not just smoking but also observing. You noticed Adriana's distress. You were aware of her and her uncle's falling out, and when she slipped into the study that night and argued, possibly even threatened him, you knew you had your chance. She'd think she'd accomplished it. The guilt would be hers. The truth would die with him. Lucero slowly rose to his feet and smiled slightly. You've got a good story, he replied, very poetic. But do you have proof? Poirot raised his finger. Only this, your cigarette case. Lucero froze. I had it examined this morning. It was left on the table at your first interview. Inside, the liner had absorbed traces of powdered strychnine, which was inconsistent with casual exposure, but rather with handling residue. The medication was secreted there before being transferred to the cork. Many veteran smugglers have a propensity of concealing their contraband in the lining of something ordinary. Lucero's face remained motionless. Poirot moved closer. I also have the maid's testimony. She saw you walk along the hallway toward the cellar at 4 p.m. the day before the murder. Not Solange, you. Not detected at the time. It was overlooked until now. Lucero gazed around the room gently. With a heavy breath, he sat down again. He was going to ruin everything, he explained plainly. I built my life around discretion, quiet trades, safe exchanges. Then he decides to seek his conscience? You killed to preserve your image, Poirot replied softly, and let an innocent woman carry the weight. Lucero shrugged, unconcerned. She was halfway there already. Leclerc moved forward, no longer still, and motioned to the officer at the door. Lucero did not resist. He stood, fixed his jacket, and strode toward them with unwavering ease. He turned to face Poirot as he passed the threshold. "You're better than they say," he mumbled. Poirot tilted his head. "And you, Monsieur Lucero, are exactly as I suspected." The door closed behind him. Silence returned. It seemed lighter now, free of hatred, but not yet full of calm. Langford disturbed the calm. "What about Adriana?" Poirot turned slowly. "She'll be liberated." "But not without scars." Solange's voice remained calm. "She should not have blamed herself." "Ah," Poirot replied gently. "But, mademoiselle, it is frequently the case with individuals who feel strongly. They think the worst of themselves before believing the worst of others." He came to the window and opened the shutters. The lake glittered anew, the morning sun now fully up. Helena stood and approached him. "You've tied it all together," she said, "but it doesn't feel finished." Poirot nodded. "No, because truth, madame, is not always justice, and justice does not always mean peace." He gazed out across the sea, his hands resting softly on the ledge. "But peace," he continued, "is something we must choose for ourselves. After all is said. After everything is done." And with that, he turned away from the window, his work completed, at least for the time being. The final rays of morning light extended across the lake like strands of glass, leaving the surface calm, as if it too had held its breath during the ordeal and could finally exhale. Inside the collector's shadow, the suffocating air of mistrust had lifted, leaving behind a softer, quieter weight. The aftermath, the reckoning. Poirot stood in the entrance hall with his bag beside him, his gloved hands resting lightly on the handle. Leclerc approached, the creases of stress on his face softened by resolve, though his eyes still carried the shadow of an unfinished thought. "She'll be released within the hour," he promised. "The paperwork is being expedited." "I spoke with the magistrate," Poirot nodded. "Bon, that's good. Justice must never be delayed when innocent people have suffered." They stood there for a bit, watching the home slowly come back to life. The crew resumed to their duties with caution. A tray of tea was softly placed in the drawing room. Curtains drawn the day before were gently opened again. A faint voice came from the top corridor, Adriana speaking quietly to the housekeeper. No tears, no outbursts. This is just a talk. Real. Human. "She still believes," Leclerc remarked slowly, "that some part of it was her fault." "Perhaps," Poirot responded, "but that is not a failure of reason. It is a hurt of the heart, the kind that stays long after reasoning has had its say." He paused. "She will understand in time. Perhaps she can't forgive herself, but to live alongside the truth. That is all we can hope for." Leclerc hesitated. "And the seal?" Poirot turned toward the study. "It'll be returned. With appropriate paperwork. The solicitor has already been notified." Leclerc nodded. "You're thorough." Poirot offered a slight smile. "One must be when the truth has been buried so long." They approached the front door where a black automobile sat, its motor purring softly on the gravel. Poirot reached for his hat and halted on the threshold. "But tell me," he added, "what will become of the collection?" Leclerc looked back over his shoulder. "That is up to the estate to sort out. Without a legitimate will, it falls back to the original one on file. Helena and Solange are named executors, if you believe it." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, that will be delicate." "You've left them with a powder keg," Leclerc admitted with a rueful smile. "Perhaps," Poirot responded, "but with a lesson. That possession is not synonymous with purpose, and a collection is not synonymous with a legacy." He stepped out onto the gravel walkway, the morning sun warming his shoulders. As he descended the stairs, he noticed her. Adriana stood at the edge of the lawn, just beyond the clipped hedges. She was looking out at the lake, a coat wrapped around her shoulders. Despite the sun, when she first saw Poirot, she remained motionless, but then she turned and met him midway, her face blank but her eyes clear. "You were right," she stated simply. Poirot tilted his head. "Only because you were honest with yourself in the end." "I didn't know," she replied. "Not really. About the seal, about Lucero, I assumed he was just a charming guest, but now I keep thinking, if I had gone inside the study earlier. If I had spoken with my uncle earlier—" "No," Poirot replied gently. "You must not walk that path. The decisions of others do not fall on your shoulders." "He invited me here as a stand-in," she explained quietly now. "A replacement for the person he truly wanted to forgive him." "Yes," Poirot confessed, "but he did choose to change, and in the end it was you who brought the truth to light." Her voice was caught. "I did not seek justice. I just wanted peace." Poirot stared at the lake. "And you will have it. Not easily, not immediately. But serenity is not a given, mademoiselle. It must be earned, slowly, through the process of healing." She nodded and stared at her hands. "What happens now?" "You will return home," Poirot stated. "You'll sleep. You'll feel the world move again, and when you're ready, you'll tell the story. Not of what occurred here, but of what you chose not to be." They shared a lengthy, quiet, reverent silence. Adriana. Her responded, "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot." He made a tiny, polite bow. "I thank you for reminding me that even the heart has logic." He turned and proceeded towards the waiting automobile. As the driver opened the door, he took one final look at the villa, the lofty windows, the stone facade, and the shadows that no longer seemed so large. There was so much hiding inside those walls: lies, ambition, fear. But there is also optimism, although silently and stubbornly. Even though one life had ended and another had nearly been destroyed, something had changed. The cycle is broken. A silence was broken. As the engine started, he relaxed into his seat. As the automobile drove away, winding down the gravel driveway, Poirot closed his eyes for a while, the rhythm of the road rising and falling beneath him. Not every case ended successfully. Not all answers provided relief. This discreet affair in the shadow of a collector's legacy provided a unique opportunity to reveal a killer's identity, the release of the innocent. In addition, a long-buried truth is being restored. Outside, the lake glistened in the sunlight. A breeze rustled the trees. The mansion, once shrouded in solitude, stood again in the calm of morning, not haunting nor hollow, but silent in a new sense. And Poirot, the small Belgian with the immaculate moustache and the persistent mind, settled back into his seat, letting the day begin again. The train to Lausanne hummed sweetly beneath the polished compartment where Hercule Poirot sat alone, its rhythmic motions swaying gently in sync with his thoughts. A silver thermos of coffee sat beside him, undisturbed. Outside the window, the scenery rolled by. Green fields dotted with cottages, the pale sparkle of lake water showing between the hills, and above it all the cloudless blue sky extending with late summer calm. He had taken off his gloves, folded them exactly next his newspaper, and sat with his hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in meditation. But Poirot wasn't dozing. No, he was reviewing, as he always did after a case, not only the facts and the answer, but also the people, the situations, and the shadows between truth and motivation. There were so many shadows in this case. When the summons arrived in Lake Geneva, he assumed it was for vanity, possibly a theft or forgery among collectors. Maximilien de Vries was known for his theatrical excesses, but Poirot believed he was motivated by control rather than malice. But it was his drive to control, to preserve not only his possessions but also his legacy, that ultimately led to his downfall. Poirot pondered Adriana once again. Her face, which was initially shuttered but later cracked with anguish and perplexity, stayed clear in his thoughts. She hadn't killed her uncle. However, she had believed herself capable of it, and that idea had nearly devastated her. He also thought of Lucero, whose mask had fallen only in the last moment, when all plausible denials had crumbled under the weight of argument. A man who is overly smart and overconfident in the midst of other people's guilt. He had created the ideal illusion, a murder with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and a scapegoat who was already beginning to believe in her own darkness. Nonetheless, Poirot had identified the flaw. The one thread in the weave that didn't fit. It had always come down to psychology, as it usually did. In his haste to frame another, Lucero overestimated his subtlety. A single unrecorded hour, an untimely excursion to the cellar, and the residue in his own cigarette case. All minor details. The little grey cells, however, had not missed them. Poirot permitted himself a little smile. What captivated him the most, however, was not the crime itself, but its aim. Lucero had not slain out of fury or passion. He had killed for survival, to hide his past, to silence a truth that, if revealed, might not have wrecked him in a court of law, but would have deprived him of power and position. That, Poirot realized, was the most hazardous reason of all. Not love, jealousy, or greed, but fear of exposure. The door of his cabin slid open with a polite tap. A steward entered and nodded graciously. "Monsieur Poirot, telegram has just arrived at the last station." Poirot accepted it with a cordial thank you before opening the clean envelope. His gaze wandered across the words, "Adriana is no longer in custody. Returns to Geneva tonight." She asked to express her gratitude. "Solicitor certifies seal returned to proper hands. Will be amended according the original directions. Lucero admits under pressure. The case is officially closed." Leclerc Poirot folded the message and tucked it into his coat pocket. So, it was finished. Justice had been served, if not in court, then in the hearts of those who were most affected. The seal, long buried in the vault of shame, had now found its appropriate place. And Adriana, perhaps she too will find her place again. Not under her uncle's shadow, but in the light of a restored truth. The steward returned, this time with freshly brewed coffee and a warm croissant wrapped in a linen cloth. Poirot thanked him before returning to the window and taking a sip of his drink. The train curved softly around a bend, revealing a large expanse of water beneath the sun. The collector's shadow was somewhere across the lake, no longer silent or disguised, but just a home. A location where one man's attempt at control resulted in turmoil, and where others discovered the steep cost of keeping secrets, even those they told themselves. Poirot breathed slowly. Murder was an unusual business. It was often not about death, but about what happened before it. Unspoken pain, unhealed betrayal, and the truth resisted until it blew. He folded his hands once again. "Murder," he said quietly to no one, "is not the final act. This is merely the climax. The true story is always written in motives." The train continued its silent journey toward the metropolis, and Poirot, finally closing his eyes, permitted himself the rarest indulgence, a moment of calm.